A 15-year-old girl asked her mother if she could go to a local fishing spot to clear her head, promising to be home by 2 p.m. She never made it back. Right from the start, investigators faced a puzzling scene that didn't add up. When the truth finally emerged 28 years later through cutting-edge DNA technology, it revealed not just the identity of a killer, but a decades-long failure of justice that left a family fighting alone for answers. This case dragged on for nearly 3 decades, with thousands of questions and countless dead ends, before genetic genealogy finally cracked what seemed like an unsolvable mystery. Danielle Howchin, who went by Dani, was born in the mid-1980s in Minnesota. She was the oldest of 3 children in a family that treasured time spent together outdoors. Dani grew up alongside her younger sister Stephanie and younger brother in a household where adventure was a way of life. The Howchin family didn't just talk about loving nature. They lived it, regularly going hiking, river rafting, rock climbing, and fishing together. In the early 1990s, when Dani was still in elementary school, her parents made a bold decision. They packed up the family and moved from Minnesota to Montana to start a new chapter. The move wasn't random. Montana offered something the family craved: access to mountains, wilderness, and endless outdoor opportunities. Dani's parents were passionate skiers who worked on the ski patrol at the resort at Big Sky, one of Montana's premier skiing destinations. Dani inherited her parents' athletic abilities and became a strong skier herself. She was so skilled on the slopes that she inspired her younger sister Stephanie to work harder just to keep up with her. The 2 sisters shared a special bond, with Dani often pushing Stephanie to challenge herself and reach new heights. Behind Dani's athletic prowess was a personality that drew people to her. She had a dry sense of humor and could make almost anyone laugh within minutes of meeting them. She showed affection in her own unique way, through playful tricks and pranks on her friends. Those who knew her understood that when Dani teased you, it meant she cared about you. Dani was more than just an outdoors enthusiast and a jokester. She was exceptionally intelligent and excelled in school. Math and science were her strongest subjects, and she demonstrated a natural aptitude for understanding complex concepts in these fields. She wasn't just good at these subjects because she studied hard. She genuinely loved learning about how things worked. By age 15, Dani had already begun thinking seriously about her future career. She talked about potentially going into the medical field, where she could use her scientific knowledge to help people. She also considered studying marine biology, combining her love of science with her fascination with the natural world. For a teenager living in landlocked Montana, dreaming of studying ocean life showed just how big Dani's ambitions were. Music was another passion that defined Dani's teenage years. She loved the grunge bands that dominated the 1990s music scene. The raw, authentic sound of bands like Nirvana, Pearl Jam, and Soundgarden resonated with her. She would listen to her carefully curated CD collection for hours, losing herself in the music that defined her generation. In September of 1996, Dani was 15 years old and in the prime of her teenage years. She was a strong student with clear goals, a loving family, and a bright future ahead of her. She had everything to live for. Within days, everything her family knew and loved about their daughter would be tested as they faced an unimaginable nightmare. Saturday, September 21st, 1996, started as a day that should have been filled with celebration. The town of Belgrade, Montana, was hosting its annual fall festival in the park, directly across the street from the Howchin family home. But more importantly to Dani, it was her father Rex's birthday. Dani had originally been scheduled to go on a trip with her church youth group that day. Many of her friends were going, and she had been looking forward to it. But at the last minute, she made a decision that would change everything. She decided to stay home instead so she could do something special for her father's birthday. Dani woke up early that morning with a plan. She wanted to bake her father a birthday cake to surprise him. She went into the kitchen and began gathering the ingredients, mixing the batter, and carefully preparing what she hoped would be a perfect birthday surprise. There was just one problem. Her father wasn't home. Rex Howchin had gone out the night before to celebrate his birthday with friends. During the evening, he had been drinking and made the responsible decision not to drive home. He stayed with friends overnight and didn't return home until later that Saturday morning, long after Danny had already started baking. When Rex finally walked through the door, Danny was upset. She had skipped her church trip specifically to be there for his birthday, waking up early to make him a cake, and he hadn't even been home. For a 15-year-old who had sacrificed her own plans to do something thoughtful, the disappointment stung. Danny needed to blow off steam, and she knew exactly how to do it. As she had done countless times before, she sought refuge in the outdoors. The woods, the rivers, and the open spaces of Montana had always been her sanctuary when she needed to think or calm down. Shortly before noon, Danny found her mother Cheryl and asked if she could go out to Cameron Bridge fishing access. The spot was a marshy, wooded area located a few miles south of Belgrade. It was a place the family knew well, a quiet location where someone could fish, walk the trails, or just spend time alone in nature. Cheryl reminded her daughter that they had friends coming over later that day for Rex's birthday celebration. It was important that Danny be home in time. Cheryl gave her permission to go, but made it clear that she had to be home by 2 p.m. To make sure Danny could keep track of time, Cheryl gave her daughter her own watch to wear. Danny agreed to the terms, took the watch, grabbed her keys with the collection of keychains she had been proudly accumulating since getting her driver's license, and headed out. She got into her white Chevrolet truck and drove toward Cameron Bridge. She had no way of knowing that within hours her family would be searching desperately for her, and that by nightfall, their worst fears would become reality. 2 o'clock came and went. Danny didn't come home. For most teenagers, being a couple of hours late might not immediately raise alarms. But Danny wasn't most teenagers. She was reliable, especially when she had made a promise to her mother. Even though she had been upset that morning about her father's absence, she would not have intentionally broken her word about being home by 2 ends. By 3 p.m., Cheryl's concern had grown into real worry. She decided she needed to go look for her daughter. Along with one of her friends, Cheryl drove out to Cameron Bridge fishing access to find Danny and bring her home. When they arrived at the fishing access parking area around 3 p.m., they immediately spotted Danny's white Chevrolet truck. But something was wrong. Very wrong. The truck was unlocked, which was unusual in itself. But what really alarmed Cheryl was what she found inside. Danny's CD collection was still in the truck. For a teenager in 1996, CDs were precious possessions, carefully selected and protected. Danny took good care of her music collection. Also inside the truck was her father's computer, another valuable item that Danny normally would never have left unattended in an unlocked vehicle. Cheryl and her friend began searching the immediate area. They found Danny's water bottle along one of the trails leading away from the parking lot. Then they found her keys, still attached to all the keychains Danny had been so proud to collect now that she could drive. The keys were just lying on the trail, abandoned. For Cheryl, this discovery was the moment when concern turned to genuine fear. Danny was a new driver. She had been so excited to get her license, so proud to be able to drive herself places. She treated her truck and everything associated with driving with care and respect. The unlocked truck filled with valuables and the discarded keys with their collection of meaningful keychains told Cheryl that something terrible had happened. Cheryl began running through the area, calling Danny's name over and over. She checked the bathrooms at the fishing access. She looked in every possible place where Danny might conceivably be. With each passing minute and each location checked without finding her daughter, the dread grew heavier. Before leaving the area to search farther away, Cheryl made a decision. She went back to Danny's truck, and left a note on it telling Danny to wait there for her if she came back. Then she expanded her search to areas beyond the immediate vicinity of the parking lot. Just after 5 p.m., Cheryl made the call that every parent dreads making. She contacted the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office and asked for help finding her daughter. Deputies responded quickly to the scene. After assessing the situation and hearing about the abandoned truck, the scattered belongings, and the fact that Danny had been missing for hours, they made the decision to call in Gallatin County Search and Rescue. Within a short time, search and rescue teams along with volunteer search groups descended on Cameron Bridge. They organized a grid search of the area, systematically covering the wooded and marshy terrain. Dozens of people spread out through the fishing access area, calling Danny's name and looking for any sign of the missing teenager. But as the sun began to set, the search commanders faced a difficult decision. The fishing access was located near a river and other smaller waterways. The area was surrounded by dense woodland. There was no ambient light, and once darkness fell, it would be nearly impossible to see. More importantly, continuing the search in those conditions would put the searchers themselves at serious risk of injury. After a few hours, the official search was called off for the night. The plan was to resume at first light the next morning when conditions would be safer. However, not everyone was willing to wait. Some family friends of the Howchins who were very familiar with the Cameron Bridge area continued searching despite the serious risks to their own safety. They knew Danny, they knew her family, and they weren't ready to give up just because it was dark. Danny's 12-year-old sister Stephanie refused to sit at home and wait. She was with a friend whose mother understood the urgency of the situation. The mother drove Stephanie and her friend around town so the girls could show Danny's picture to members of the public and ask if anyone had seen her. One of the places they stopped was at the local high school, where there was a girls' basketball game that night. Stephanie and her friend walked through the gym showing people Danny's picture and explaining that she was missing. Among the people who heard about Danny's disappearance that night was a boy named Levi, a close friend of Stephanie's. Levi and his family lived very close to the Cameron Bridge fishing access area. His father Kelly knew the area extremely well. When Levi heard the details of Danny's disappearance, he immediately called his father and begged him to go help look for her. Kelly was very reluctant. It was dark, the area was dangerous, and the official search had been called off for good reasons. But his son's pleas eventually convinced him. Kelly grabbed a flashlight and headed down to Cameron Bridge to search. He hadn't been searching long when his flashlight batteries died. In the pitch darkness, continuing alone would be foolish. Kelly went to his brother Mike's home, which was nearby. They got fresh batteries, and the two brothers went out together to look for Danny. For about 45 minutes, Mike and Kelly searched through the dark, marshy terrain. Mike was about to tell his brother that they should give up and go home for the night. It was simply too dangerous to continue. But before he could say the words, Kelly made a discovery. Kelly found Danny. When Mike walked over to where his brother stood, he saw the back of Danny's head. Even in the darkness, he could tell immediately that she was dead. At that exact moment, Danny's father Rex had returned to Cameron Bridge for one last search before giving up for the night. He was walking into the woods just as Mike and Kelly were coming out. They stopped him and told him what they had found. Rex Howchin's worst fear had just been confirmed. His daughter was gone. Danny had been found lying face down in shallow water, concealed underneath a thick layer of marshy overgrowth. The location where her body was discovered was not far from where her keys and water bottle had been found earlier on the trail. Investigators immediately noticed several details about Danny's body and how it was positioned. Her left arm was extended up above her head. The watch that her mother had given her that morning had been pulled down from her wrist onto her left hand. One of her sandals was missing. Officers searched the area and found the sandal approximately 20 feet away from where Danny's body lay. When investigators examined Danny's clothing, they found more concerning details. Her bra had been pushed up above her breasts. The lower left edge of her underwear was rolled over. To experienced investigators, these details suggested that Danny's body had been dragged by her left arm to the location where it was found, then concealed under the grasses and reeds of the swampy area. The medical examiner conducted an autopsy to determine how Danny had died. He found muddy material in Danny's stomach and throughout her upper and lower airways. There was a recent laceration in her vagina that was indicative of sexual assault. 4 naturally shed arm hairs that did not belong to Danny were found in her underwear and on her cervix. These hairs could not be matched to anyone in Danny's life. The medical examiner determined that Danny had died by drowning. However, his ruling on the manner of death was puzzling. Instead of ruling it a homicide, he classified the manner of death as undetermined. In his report, he wrote that the manner of death would remain undetermined until such time additional information indicates otherwise. This finding baffled many people familiar with the details of the case, both within Danny's family and in law enforcement. The scene appeared to show that Danny had been dragged so her body could be concealed. There was clear evidence of sexual assault. Someone else had to have been involved in Danny's death. How could this possibly be anything other than a homicide? Sheriff Bill Slaughter of Gallatin County told the public that while Danny's death was being investigated as a homicide, he believed the evidence was not clear. In an interview with the Bozeman Daily Chronicle, Sheriff Slaughter made a statement that shocked Danny's family and supporters. He said there was no indication of foul play in the case. "I think we've got to be prepared for the fact that this may have been an accidental drowning," he told the newspaper. Sheriff Slaughter's reasoning centered on what he claimed was a lack of cuts or bruises on Danny's body. However, the autopsy had documented minor blunt force injuries to Danny's head and extremities, as well as cuts on the sides of her face. These injuries could have come from running through the woods or from trying to pull someone's hands away from her face. The sheriff focused particularly on one detail. Danny had been wearing a knee brace on the day of her death. She had injured her knee a few weeks earlier while dancing with friends. Although her injury was nearly healed, and she was due to be cleared by her doctor soon to stop wearing the brace, Sheriff Slaughter theorized that she could have re-injured her knee at the fishing access, gotten stuck in the mud, fallen over, and drowned. The problems with this theory were numerous. Danny was an exceptionally athletic teenager and a strong swimmer. The water where she was found was so shallow that all she would have had to do to breathe was turn her head to the side. Her toxicology screening detected only caffeine, meaning there were no drugs or alcohol in her system that would have impaired her body's natural instinct to fight for air. Most importantly, the theory didn't explain how mud was forced into Danny's airway and stomach. Drowning victims typically have water in their lungs. The presence of mud throughout Danny's respiratory system and digestive tract was more consistent with her head being forcibly held underwater and pushed into the mud below the surface. Despite these obvious contradictions, the official classification of Danny's death as undetermined rather than homicide would have lasting consequences for the investigation. It sent a message about how seriously the case was being taken, and it was a message that frustrated those who believed Danny deserved better. Cindy Boetel became a Gallatin County Sheriff's deputy just days before Danny died. Years later, she would speak publicly about what she observed regarding the investigation into Danny's case. When she joined the Detective Bureau in 2006, she tried to pursue new leads in Danny's case, but was met with resistance from her superiors. Previous investigators who had been assigned to the case provided no help and seemed uninterested in revisiting old evidence. Boetel stated that investigating Danny's case never appeared to be a priority to the leadership within the sheriff's office during those crucial early years. Multiple other individuals connected to the sheriff's office at the time of Danny's death have echoed similar concerns. They have been critical of how the office handled the case and stated that the leadership was too quick to dismiss Danny's death as an accident or even imply that it might have been a suicide. A former sheriff's deputy who worked at the office reported that Sheriff Slaughter's attitude seemed to indicate that he just wanted the case to be over. He wanted a resolution that would allow the office to close the file and move on, even if that resolution meant accepting an implausible accident theory over a more complex homicide investigation. Sheriff Slaughter has denied these accusations. He has maintained that the case was always treated as a homicide, regardless of its formal classification, and that it was never deprioritized. However, the actions taken in the years immediately following Danny's death tell a different story. The foreign hairs found in Danny's underwear and on her cervix were critical evidence. However, because these hairs had been naturally shed rather than forcibly pulled out, they did not contain their roots. Hair roots are the main source of nuclear DNA, which can provide a complete genetic profile. Without the roots, investigators were limited to testing for mitochondrial DNA, which is less specific and found in far fewer copies within cells. In the 1990s, DNA technology was still relatively new to law enforcement. The capabilities that would become standard practice in later decades simply didn't exist yet. The hairs were tested, but no matches were found in any databases. With no DNA match and no obvious suspects, the investigation had nowhere to go. Detectives interviewed people who knew Danny and asked about her state of mind, her relationships, and whether anyone had any reason to want to hurt her. Every interview led nowhere. Danny had no enemies. She had no secret boyfriend who might have been involved. She had no conflicts with anyone that would explain what happened to her. The family and friends who might normally have been looked at as potential suspects were easily cleared. They had solid alibis. They had been at the fall festival, at work, or in other locations with witnesses who could verify their whereabouts. None of them had any motive. Physical evidence didn't link any of them to the scene. The sheriff's office looked at known sex offenders in the area. They checked criminal databases for similar cases. They examined whether any patterns might link Danny's case to other unsolved crimes. Nothing matched. No one stood out. Every lead that seemed promising at first ultimately fizzled out. As weeks turned into months and months turned into years, the case grew colder. Without new evidence or new leads, there was simply nowhere for investigators to go. The file remained open, but active investigation essentially stopped. For Danny's family, the lack of progress was agonizing. They knew that someone had killed their daughter. They knew that evidence existed, but they were helpless to do anything about it. The person responsible for Danny's death was out there somewhere, living their life while Danny's family lived with a wound that would never fully heal. The 4 foreign hairs found on Danny's body sat in evidence storage, waiting for technology to advance enough that they could finally tell their story. It would take more than 2 decades. While the sheriff's office appeared content to let Danny's case fade into the background, her family never stopped fighting. Danny's mother Cheryl, her father Rex, and especially her sister Stephanie became advocates not just for Danny, but for all cold case victims whose cases had been abandoned by the system. Stephanie had been just 12 years old when her big sister was killed. She grew up in the shadow of that loss, but she channeled her pain into determination. She would not allow Danny to be forgotten. She would not allow the investigation to simply end because it was difficult or inconvenient. In 2019, Danny's family began more actively campaigning for the investigation to receive additional resources and renewed attention. They reached out to media outlets. They used social media to keep Danny's case in the public eye. They contacted advocacy groups that specialized in helping families of cold case victims. They refused to be quiet. Their persistence began to pay off. They learned that Captain Matt Boxberger of the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office had taken a personal interest in finally solving Danny's case. Unlike the leadership that had been in charge in 1996, Boxberger believed that Danny's case could and should be solved. He understood that advances in forensic technology had created new possibilities for cases that had once seemed hopeless. In 2019, Danny's case was officially reopened. This wasn't just a symbolic gesture. Resources were committed. New investigators were assigned. Old evidence was re-examined with fresh eyes and new technologies. In 2021, Dan Springer became the sheriff of Gallatin County. He inherited Danny's case among many others, but he made a decision that would prove crucial. He committed additional resources to the investigation and made solving cold cases like Danny's a priority for his office. Sheriff Springer hired Tom Elfmont, a retired Los Angeles Police Department officer who was working as a private investigator. Elfmont had extensive experience and brought a new perspective to the case. Elfmont in turn reached out to Sergeant Court Deeg of the Newport Beach Police Department, a specialist in using advanced DNA technology to solve cases. The team began a comprehensive review of all the evidence in Danny's case. In August of 2023, during a re-examination of the evidence that had been stored for 27 years, a forensic examiner made a critical discovery. Semen was found in Danny's underwear that had not been previously identified. This discovery changed everything. On August 23, 2023, nearly 27 years after her death, Danny's case was finally formally reclassified as a homicide. The manner of death that should have been obvious from the beginning was now officially recognized. Danny had been murdered. The 4 foreign hairs found on Danny's body in 1996 had been sitting in evidence storage for more than 2 decades. Earlier DNA testing had been unable to extract enough usable genetic material to create a profile that could be searched in criminal databases. But by the 2020s, forensic DNA technology had advanced dramatically. The hairs were submitted to Astria Forensics in California, a laboratory that specializes in cutting-edge forensic DNA genome sequencing. Using techniques that hadn't existed when Danny died, technicians at Astrea were able to develop a partial DNA profile from one of the hairs. Investigators immediately searched the combined DNA index system, known as CODIS, which contains DNA profiles from convicted offenders across the United States. They were hopeful that after all these years, they might finally get a match. But there was no match in CODIS. Whoever had killed Danny had never been convicted of a crime serious enough to require submitting a DNA sample to the database. For a traditional investigation, this would have been another dead end. But the investigative team had one more option: genetic genealogy. This relatively new technique had begun solving cold cases across the country by using consumer DNA databases and family tree research to identify suspects through their relatives. The DNA profile was sent to Parabon Nanolabs in Virginia, a company that specializes in genetic genealogy for law enforcement. Parabon's team uploaded the DNA profile to GEDmatch, a public database where people voluntarily upload their DNA results to find relatives and build family trees. The system found several distant genetic matches. None of these matches were to the perpetrator himself, but they were to people who shared some genetic material with him. They were distant relatives, perhaps 3rd or 4th cousins, who had uploaded their DNA to GEDmatch for genealogy purposes and had no idea their genetic information would help solve a murder. A team of genealogists at Parabon began the painstaking work of building family trees. They started with the genetic matches and worked backward through generations, identifying common ancestors. Then they worked forward through the generations, identifying all the descendants of those common ancestors. They built elaborate family trees showing how hundreds of people were related to one another. The process took months. Genealogists examined birth records, marriage records, death certificates, census data, and any other documents they could find. They traced families through multiple states and across several generations. Slowly, they began to narrow down the possibilities. They were looking for someone who fit specific criteria. The person had to be the right age to have been alive in 1996. They had to have been in or near Belgrade, Montana on September 21, 1996. They had to be male, based on the DNA evidence. And they had to fit into the family tree structure indicated by the genetic matches. In 2024, after extensive genealogical research, the team finally narrowed their search down to one person: Paul Nathaniel Hutchinson. Paul Hutchinson was 55 years old in 2024. He was a married father of 2 adult children. For 22 years, he had worked as a fisheries biologist for the Bureau of Land Management, based in the agency's field office in Dillon, Montana, where he also lived. To everyone who knew him, Hutchinson seemed like an upstanding member of the community. He was involved in conservation work through his job. He had a stable marriage. He had raised his children. He had never been in trouble with the law. In fact, he had no criminal history at all. He didn't even have any traffic violations on his record. But when investigators started digging into his background, they discovered something crucial. In September of 1996, when Danny was killed, Paul Hutchinson had just enrolled as a student at Montana State University in Bozeman. Bozeman was just a short drive from Belgrade. Cameron Bridge fishing access, where Danny had been murdered, would have been easily accessible to a Montana State student. Hutchinson was known to be an avid outdoorsman. His career as a fisheries biologist reflected a lifelong interest in rivers, streams, and natural waterways. It was entirely plausible that he had been at Cameron Bridge on September 21, 1996, for recreational purposes. The fishing access was exactly the kind of place someone with his interests would visit. There was no known connection between Danny and Hutchinson. They didn't go to the same school. They didn't have mutual friends. There was no evidence they had ever met before that day. Investigators came to believe that Danny's rape and murder had been crimes of opportunity. Hutchinson had been at Cameron Bridge that day. He had encountered Danny alone on the trails, and he had made a choice that would destroy multiple lives. Investigators now had a name, but they needed to confirm the match. They needed a direct DNA sample from Hutchinson to compare against the DNA found on Danny's body. They couldn't simply ask him for a sample. If he refused, or if he realized he was a suspect, he might flee or destroy evidence. The investigative team developed a plan. They would approach Hutchinson and request an interview, but they wouldn't immediately reveal the full extent of what they knew. They would try to obtain a DNA sample through other means, and they would watch his reaction carefully. On July 23, 2024, investigators approached Paul Hutchinson outside the Bureau of Land Management office, where he worked in Dillon, Montana. He was unloading a pickup truck with two other people when the investigators arrived. When they identified themselves as being with the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office and said they were hoping to speak with him, Hutchinson's reaction was immediate and telling. According to investigators, he went pale. The color drained from his face. Hutchinson agreed to speak with investigators. The interview lasted approximately 2 hours. Throughout the interview, investigators reported that Hutchinson showed extreme signs of nervousness. He was sweating profusely, despite the temperature being comfortable. He scratched at his face repeatedly. He bit his hand. His body language screamed guilt. At one point during the interview, investigators showed Hutchinson a picture of Danny. His reaction was dramatic. He slumped down in his chair. He looked profoundly uncomfortable. He appeared to recognize her. The investigators didn't tell Hutchinson everything they knew. They didn't reveal that they had DNA evidence linking him to Danny's murder. They were still gathering information, still building their case. The interview was just one step in the process. When the interview concluded, Hutchinson left the building. Investigators watched as he got into his vehicle. His behavior was erratic. He seemed agitated and unstable. They let him go, but continued monitoring the situation. Early the next morning at 4:17 a.m. on July 24th, Hutchinson called 911. He asked for assistance. Then he hung up. When deputies from the Beaverhead County Sheriff's Office arrived at the location indicated by the 911 call, they found Paul Hutchinson's body on the side of the road. He had shot himself in the head. A DNA sample was taken from Hutchinson's body. That sample was compared to the DNA found on Danny's body in 1996. It was a perfect match. After 28 years, Danny's killer had finally been definitively identified. On August 8, 2024, Sheriff Dan Springer held a press conference to announce that Paul Nathaniel Hutchinson had been identified as the individual responsible for the rape and murder of Danielle Howchin. The news spread quickly through Montana and beyond. For many people who had known Hutchinson, the revelation was shocking. Friends and colleagues described him as upbeat, generous, and deeply involved in his community. He had donated to charity. He had been a dedicated father. He had seemed completely normal. The idea that he had been hiding this terrible secret for 28 years was almost impossible to comprehend. An obituary for Hutchinson was briefly posted online by his family. But once he was publicly identified as Danny's killer, his wife replaced it with a statement. The statement read, "We are absolutely heartbroken to learn this news, and our hearts go out to the Howchin family. It is good to know that they will at last be able to find the closure that they deserve. Our own family was already reeling from dealing with Paul's suicide. In 24 years of marriage, there was never any hint that something like this could be lurking in the background. Paul was an exceptional husband and father. This latest news makes our grieving so much more complicated. We would appreciate being given the space to process and come to terms with this development as we mourn." The Hutchinson family found themselves in an impossible position. They had lost a husband and father to suicide. Then, almost immediately, they learned that the man they had loved and trusted for decades had committed a horrific crime. They were victims of his actions in their own way, left to grapple with questions that would never have answers. Sheriff Springer acknowledged the difficult situation the Hutchinson family faced. "I feel sorrow for the Hutchinson family," he said in an interview with the Montana Free Press. They were unaware, of course, and in many ways they are also victims of this man. For Danny's family, the identification of her killer brought a complex mix of emotions. Danny's sister Stephanie spoke at the press conference announcing the breakthrough in the case. She expressed happiness that the case was finally solved, but that feeling was quickly replaced by frustration, disbelief, and anger. The institutions that are designed to protect the rights of victims, to ensure that vicious killers are incarcerated, to deliver justice in Montana, those institutions failed my sister," Stephanie said, her voice steady but filled with emotion. "Danielle's story should anger you, should make you think about your mothers, your sisters, your wives, and your daughters, should make you think about everything you would do to protect and honor the women you love." Stephanie's words captured not just her family's grief, but their fury at a system that had failed Danny for 28 years. The sheriff's office in 1996 had been too quick to dismiss her death as an accident. They had deprioritized the investigation. They had not pursued leads aggressively. They had allowed the case to go cold when better work might have solved it decades earlier. In an interview with KBZK News, Stephanie addressed Hutchinson's suicide directly. "I don't condone suicide. I think that if people are hurting, they should get help. But I am really glad that Danny's killer is dead, even if by his own hand. This is justice for my sister. And the idea of him being out there doesn't have to haunt me anymore, and doesn't have to haunt my family. And so this is resolution." Because Hutchinson had taken his own life, he would never be tried or convicted for what he did to Danny. He would never face a jury. Danny's family would never have the opportunity to confront him in court. He would never serve time in prison. In some ways, his suicide was a final act of cowardice, an escape from accountability. But in another sense, the resolution was complete. There was no question about Hutchinson's guilt. The DNA evidence was conclusive. Danny's family didn't have to endure years of trials and appeals. They didn't have to worry about him ever being released. And they didn't have to spend decades wondering if the right person had been identified. Even with Hutchinson identified as Danny's killer, many questions remain unanswered. Because he took his life before he could be interrogated or prosecuted, the full story of what happened on September 21, 1996, will likely never be known. Investigators believe that Danny's murder was a crime of opportunity. Hutchinson was probably at Cameron Bridge fishing access that day for legitimate recreational purposes. He encountered Danny alone on the trails, and in that moment, he made the decision to attack her. But why? What motivated him to rape and kill a 15-year-old girl he had never met? Was it purely sexual? Did something about Danny specifically trigger him? Or would any young woman alone in that location that day have been at risk? Hutchinson's background offers few clues. He had no history of violence. He had never been arrested or accused of similar crimes. If he attacked other women before or after Danny, those cases remain unsolved and unconnected to him. The timeline of that day raises questions too. How long had Hutchinson been at Cameron Bridge before he encountered Danny? Did he follow her from the parking lot, or did they cross paths deeper in the woods? How long did the attack last? And how did he manage to leave the scene without being seen by anyone else who might have been in the area? The fact that Hutchinson moved away from Montana just 2 months after killing Danny is noteworthy. In November 1996, he and his mother relocated to Washington, D.C. Was this move already planned, or was it a reaction to what he had done? Did he leave Montana to escape potential investigation, or was it simply a coincidence? From the time he moved to Washington, D.C. until his death in 2024, Hutchinson stayed completely off law enforcement's radar. He never committed another crime serious enough to come to police attention. He never had to submit DNA to any database. He lived a seemingly normal, productive life for nearly 3 decades while Danny's family suffered without answers. The psychological profile of someone who could commit such a violent crime and then successfully compartmentalize it for 28 years is disturbing. How did Hutchinson live with what he had done? Did he feel remorse? Did he think about Danny over the years? Or did he simply push it out of his mind and move on with his life? His suicide the day after being interviewed by investigators suggests that he knew his secret was about to be exposed. Rather than face the consequences of his actions, rather than give Danny's family the answers they deserved, he chose to end his life. In doing so, he took the full truth with him. The resolution of Danny's case through genetic genealogy represents a triumph of modern forensic science, but it also highlights significant failures in how her case was handled from the beginning. Sheriff Bill Slaughter's decision to publicly suggest that Danny's death might have been an accidental drowning, despite clear evidence to the contrary, had lasting consequences. It set a tone that the case wasn't a priority. It signaled to the public and to potential witnesses that the investigation wasn't being taken seriously. It allowed Hutchinson to continue living his life without fear of being caught. The resistance that Deputy Cindy Boettle encountered when she tried to pursue new leads in Danny's case years later demonstrated that the problems weren't limited to the initial investigation. There was an institutional reluctance to revisit the case, to admit that it had been mishandled, to commit the resources necessary to solve it. If the sheriff's office had properly processed the crime scene from the beginning, more evidence might have been collected. If they had treated Danny's death as the obvious homicide it was, the investigation might have been more aggressive in those crucial early days. If they had followed up on tips more thoroughly, Hutchinson's name might have come up during the initial investigation. It's worth noting that once Eugene was caught, the police department came under heavy criticism. Reports indicate that the original team of investigators had received a tip with Hutchinson's name just a year after the murder. Yet for reasons no one can explain, they never even spoke to him. This single failure may have allowed Hutchinson to evade justice for an additional 27 years. The question of what if haunts this case. What if the investigation had been handled properly from the beginning? What if Hutchinson had been identified and arrested in 1997 or 1998? Danny's family would have had answers decades sooner. They would have been spared nearly 3 decades of uncertainty and frustration. And depending on when he was caught, Hutchinson might have spent his entire adult life in prison instead of living freely, raising a family, and building a career. The failures in Danny's case weren't unique. Across the country, cold cases languished for decades because of inadequate investigations, limited technology, or simply because they weren't prioritized. Danny's case represents both a cautionary tale and a call to action. Sheriff Dan Springer, who took over the office in 2021, has acknowledged that mistakes were made. By committing resources to solving cold cases and bringing in experts like Tom Elfmont and working with specialists like Sergeant Court Deeg, Springer has shown a commitment to doing better. But that commitment came 25 years too late for Danny's family. Despite the decades of frustration and systemic failure, Danny's case has had a positive impact that extends far beyond her own family. Danny's case went down in history as the very first case in Montana to be solved through genetic genealogy. This groundbreaking achievement opened doors for other cold cases in the state. Investigators working on unsolved murders that had sat dormant for years suddenly had new hope. Evidence that had been sitting in storage considered unsolvable could now be re-examined with this powerful new tool. Since Danny's case was solved using genetic genealogy, dozens of other cold cases across Montana and the broader United States have been cracked using the same technique. Families who had spent decades without answers have finally received closure. Killers who thought they had gotten away with murder have been brought to justice. The technique that identified Hutchinson has become a standard tool in the modern investigator's arsenal. The publicity surrounding Danny's case has also raised awareness about the importance of properly investigating suspicious deaths from the beginning. Law enforcement agencies have been reminded that premature conclusions about accidents or suicides can have devastating consequences. The pressure to close cases quickly must be balanced against the need to thoroughly investigate all possibilities. Danny's family, particularly her sister Stephanie, have become advocates for other families dealing with cold cases. They have used their platform to push for better resources for investigations, for improved DNA testing capabilities, and for changes in how cases are prioritized and managed. They have spoken at conferences, participated in documentaries, and worked with advocacy groups to ensure that other families don't have to fight as hard as they did for justice. The case has also highlighted the importance of persistence. Danny's family never gave up. They refused to accept that her case would remain unsolved. They kept Danny's memory alive. They pressured law enforcement. They demanded action. Their refusal to be silent ultimately played a role in getting the case reopened and solved. For the community of Belgrade, Montana, Danny's case served as a tragic reminder that violence can happen anywhere. The fall festival that was happening across the street from Danny's house on the day she died has continued every year since, but the memory of what happened to Danny lingers. Parents hold their children a little tighter. People are more cautious about letting loved ones go off alone. The illusion of perfect safety in a small Montana town was shattered on September 21, 1996. In some ways, the resolution of Danny's case has brought healing to the community, as well as to her family. For 28 years, there was a killer among them who had never been identified. People wondered if someone they knew, someone they passed on the street or worked with, could have been responsible. Now they know. And while the knowledge that Hutchinson lived and worked in Montana for years after killing Danny is disturbing, at least the uncertainty is gone. More than anything else, it's important that Danny be remembered for who she was, not just for how she died. Danny was a girl who loved the outdoors, who found peace and joy in Montana's mountains and rivers. She was a talented skier who inspired her younger sister to push herself harder. She was a dedicated student with big dreams of becoming a doctor or a marine biologist. She was a teenager who loved grunge music and carefully curated her CD collection. She was a daughter who woke up early to bake a birthday cake for her father. She was a prankster who showed affection through playful jokes with her friends. She was 15 years old when her life was stolen from her. She never got to pursue her dreams of a career in medicine or science. She never got to graduate from high school. She never went to college. She never fell in love, got married, or had children of her own. All of those possibilities, all of that potential, was erased in a moment of violence in the woods near Cameron Bridge. Danny's sister Stephanie was just 12 when she lost her big sister. She grew up without the person who had been her role model and inspiration. She faced adolescence and adulthood without the sibling who should have been there to guide her, support her, and share life's milestones. The hole Danny's death left in Stephanie's life can never be filled. Danny's parents had to bury their oldest child and live with the knowledge that someone had hurt her in the worst possible way. They had to watch their other children grow up under the shadow of their sister's unsolved murder. They had to fight for decades to get answers that should have been provided years earlier. The Howchin family's resilience in the face of such tragedy is remarkable. They could have given up. They could have accepted that Danny's case would never be solved and tried to move on with their lives as best they could. Instead, they fought. They demanded justice. They refused to let Danny be forgotten. And ultimately, their persistence paid off. Danny's case represents something larger than just one girl's tragic death. It represents the potential of forensic science to bring justice to cold cases that once seemed hopeless. It represents the importance of proper investigation and the consequences when law enforcement fails in its duty. And it represents the power of a family's refusal to give up. Genetic genealogy has revolutionized cold case investigation. The technique uses consumer DNA databases, family tree research, and genetic matching to identify suspects through their relatives. It works even when the perpetrator has never been arrested or submitted DNA to a criminal database. Since the technique gained prominence with the arrest of the Golden State Killer in 2018, it has been used to solve hundreds of cases across the United States. However, genetic genealogy also raises privacy concerns. The people whose DNA profiles helped identify Hutchinson had uploaded their genetic information to public databases for genealogy purposes. They had no idea their DNA would be used in a criminal investigation. They had no connection to the crime. Some privacy advocates worry about the implications of law enforcement using consumer DNA databases this way. Law enforcement and prosecutors argue that solving murders and bringing closure to families outweighs these privacy concerns. They point to cases like Danny's, where traditional investigation techniques had failed completely and genetic genealogy was the only way to identify the perpetrator. They argue that people who upload their DNA to public databases should understand that their information could be accessed for legitimate law enforcement purposes. The debate over genetic genealogy's use in criminal investigations continues. But for Danny's family, there's no debate. Without this technology, Hutchinson would never have been identified. He would have died of old age, his secret safe. The Howchin family would have gone the rest of their lives without knowing who killed Danny. The technology that identified Hutchinson gave them something priceless: answers. Danny's case also highlights the importance of preserving evidence even when cases go cold. The hairs found on Danny's body in 1996 were carefully stored for 28 years. If they had been lost, damaged, or destroyed, the genetic genealogy investigation would have been impossible. Law enforcement agencies across the country have been reminded of the need to properly store and maintain evidence from cold cases, because technology that doesn't exist today might be available in the future. As of November 2024, Paul Hutchinson is dead, having taken his own life to avoid facing justice for what he did to Danny. The case is officially closed. Danny's killer has been identified with scientific certainty. Her family finally has the answers they fought for decades to obtain. But the resolution of Danny's case doesn't undo the failures that preceded it. It doesn't give Danny back the life she should have had. It doesn't erase 28 years of pain and uncertainty for her family. And it doesn't fully answer all the questions about what happened on September 21st, 1996. Stephanie Howchin has said that while she's grateful for the resolution, the celebration was short-lived. The anger at the system that failed her sister remains. The frustration at the decades lost to inadequate investigation cannot be erased. The knowledge that Hutchinson lived freely for 28 years while Danny's family suffered is something they'll carry forever. Still, there is justice in knowing. There is closure in certainty. Danny's case is no longer a mystery. Her killer has been identified, and while Hutchinson will never face trial, will never be convicted, will never serve time in prison, he also won't live another day. He died knowing that his secret had been discovered, that he had been caught, that the world would know what he had done. For other families dealing with cold cases, Danny's story offers hope. It demonstrates that cases can be solved decades later. It shows that persistence matters. It proves that advances in technology can provide answers that seemed impossible before. And it reminds everyone that the fight for justice is always worth fighting, no matter how long it takes. Dani Howchin was 15 years old when she was raped and murdered on September 21, 1996. She would have been 43 years old in 2024. For 28 years, her family lived without knowing who had taken her from them. Now they know. The case that Sheriff Bill Slaughter once suggested might be an accidental drowning has been definitively proven to be murder. The killer who evaded justice for nearly 3 decades has been identified. It took too long. The system failed Dani and her family in profound ways. But in the end, the truth emerged. And that truth, painful as it is what Dani's family fought for. That truth is what they deserved. And that truth is Dani's legacy. This case serves as a reminder that justice delayed is not necessarily justice denied. Thanks to advances in genetic genealogy and the dedication of investigators who refused to let Dani's case remain cold, her family found the answers they needed. Dozens of other families dealing with cold cases have since found similar closure through the same technology. Dani's story reminds us to cherish the people we love, to pay attention when something seems wrong, and to never give up fighting for truth and justice. It reminds law enforcement to take every case seriously from the beginning, to preserve evidence carefully, and to remain open to new technologies and techniques that might solve cases years later. Most importantly, Dani's story reminds us that behind every cold case is a real person who deserves to be remembered, a family that deserves answers, and a community that deserves to know the truth. Share your thoughts on this story in the comments section, and don't forget to press the like button if you enjoyed my video. Thank you for watching.